Quicker than you can say people's martyr, that sentry was dispatched to glory by a VPA recon squad who now started crawling over the dome looking for the Chinese soldiers. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of China's army. I'm Jason Clower. On February 7th of 1979, at a PLA base in Guangdong, a young PLA soldier who was about the equivalent of a private first class was notified that in 10 days he would be going to war in Vietnam. That must have shocked him, but late that night, something even more sobering happened. He was called urgently to the company HQ, and in a room, he found waiting for him not only his platoon leader, but also the company commander and the company political officer. If I were him, I would be wondering what political crime I was about to be accused of and how I was going to survive the gulag. But instead, they said to him, Comrade Wang Zhijun, this company needs leaders, and you will have to step up and do your part. We're making you a squad leader. Leader, he must have thought. He'd been in the army for a year. He was just a lowly ammo bearer for a machine gun squad. He didn't even have a gun. He was supposed to lead a squad now? Then the news got worse. Turned out he wouldn't be leading his squad. He was going to lead someone else's. A squad full of fuck-ups and problem children. They explained, Comrade Wang, we're giving you first squad. They have a lot of morons and cowards. We need you to keep them from falling apart under pressure. Oh, no, not first squad. These guys were famous, if you can call it that, famous throughout the company as screw-ups. One in the squad was this ultra-low IQ fat body named Li, and it must have been a mystery to everybody how this guy had gotten accepted into the army, which kept a very high bar since lots of people wanted to join the PLA. Well, Lee meant well, but he was a slow, weak, and dumb sort of private Gomer Pyle equivalent. Another of the problem soldiers in Wang's new squad was this scrawny, bookish guy named Liu. He had tried to get into college, and he had just fallen short of the requirements on the entrance exam. So instead, his family arranged for him to join the army as a sort of plan B for starting some kind of promising career in the economic wreckage that was China in the 70s. So they had absolutely not considered that their son, the little bookworm, might actually get sent to war. And now this guy was freaking out and trying to think of anything that he could to get him discharged before his unit went to the front. And he wasn't the only one in first squad that the company officers thought were at risk of deserting or wounding themselves or even killing themselves or perhaps even defecting to the enemy when they got to the front just to avoid fighting. So the new squad leader, Wang Zhijun, was told to organize his three-man fire teams in such a way that every one fuck-up soldier would have two team members to assist him, which meant to watch him at all times. Wang was dismayed to get promoted to that kind of responsibility after just a year in the army, but he can't have been completely surprised. For the preceding month or more, any low-ranking enlisted nobody in that camp could see that something was going on in their unit by the way that their leaders were getting shuffled around. They were getting promoted to jobs one or two levels up and then replaced by very junior people, including buck privates even. And this wasn't just their unit. This was happening all over the PLA at every level. Wang Zhijun reported to his platoon lieutenant, who until last month had been an enlisted man too. This guy had about 4 years of service, so in US Army terms, I guess that would make him like maybe a newly promoted sergeant. But now he was a platoon leader, and as Wang took his lieutenant's instructions, he had a problem. This Lieutenant Pan couldn't exactly speak Mandarin, at least not intelligibly. He was from the deep South, where the local dialect is about as far from standard Mandarin as, say, Portuguese is from English. And so, in these pre-war instructions, Wang could only understand about half the words that his lieutenant was saying. Friends, if this sounds like a recipe for disaster, it was. But believe it or not, Wang Zhizun was actually in pretty good shape compared to other PLA soldiers that night, because at least he was going to war with a very high speed, very motivated division. For us, it's easy to forget that PLA units have very, very strong unit identities and traditions because they don't have like cool names like the Royal Leicestershire Regiment or the King's Own Scottish Borderers. They just have these bland looking numbers. But PLA divisions and regiments are as individual and personal as clans and families. Wang's division, the 163rd, was a doozy, and it still is. It's now the 163rd Combined Arms Brigade, a light mech outfit. This division was descended directly from a storied Red Army unit from Civil War days called the Red Army 1st Regiment. And that unit produced more PLA generals than Skull and Bones has produced US presidents. A lot of these alumni from the 163rd, who had become general officers, now had sons serving in the 163rd also. And these sons were explicitly expected to conduct themselves with conspicuous gallantry. There are lots of stories about the eve of the Sino-Vietnamese War and sons of high officials and officers being shifted out of frontline positions where maybe they would be in danger. And I have no doubt that that did happen. But in the 163rd, when they went to war with all these generals' sons, so densely packed that you could visit any company in the outfit at random and you would be sure to find at least one son of a general officer there, to say nothing of uncles and what have you. In that division, the ethos was very different. In fact, we have a memoir by an aide to General Xu Shiyu, who was the Eastern Theater commander in that Sino-Vietnamese invasion. His nephew was a platoon commander in the 163rd. And some of the other aides to General Xu suggested that maybe General Xu let them quietly move his favored nephew to some other job in the rear where he'd be safe from the fighting. And the memoir says that General Xu exploded so volcanically that he was whomping the table, screaming at them for suggesting this. And the aide said it was extremely awkward and embarrassing for all of them. But also, he said they were super proud of the old man. And they said, like, behind his back later, they were like giving each other the thumbs up, like, yeah, this guy's a stud. Yeah. Also, General Xu's deputy, General Jiang, also had two sons in the 163rd Division. And he told them, look, sons, when this campaign is over, unless you've been decorated for bravery, don't even bother visiting me. So he was really excited when he learned that one of his sons had been gut shot while rescuing a wounded soldier. And instead of asking how badly his son was wounded, he goes, yes, he's getting decorated. Like, wow, a lucky break. Later, he was also really pleased to learn that his other son, who is a recon squad leader in the 163rd, had also been wounded by an artillery shell, and that he would also be decorated. Well, Wang said that this was actually quite typical of Chinese military families in the 70s. Now, just remember as a caveat that this Chinese military caste in the PLA was small. They weren't just like a random cross section of Chinese society. These were very, very serious, self-selecting, true believing communists, for one thing. Also, even though for Chinese people in general in the 70s, sending your sons to the military was the one sure road to advancement in life. And even though people generally thought pretty highly of the PLA as an institution, and they were fairly grateful that the PLA had held their country together during the Cultural Revolution, nevertheless, China was still China culturally. And for 2,500 years, China had a basically anti-military culture that regarded the military class as the lowest form of civilized life. So on the eve of the 1979 invasion of Vietnam, the problem for the PLA was that even though they had this highly motivated, military caste that sent its sons to become fire-breathing army officers, this caste was very small within the totality of Chinese society, and they did not have enough officers to go around. If you're a fan of this channel, you'll remember that throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s, there really wasn't a lot of turnover among aging PLA officers. They tended not to get promoted very fast and to just kind of age in place. And that was okay as long as they were a peacetime army. It was great to have a regimental commander who had been an experienced regimental commander since the Civil War, the 50s. But on the eve of battle, this wasn't so great anymore, if only because they needed to scale up the units very quickly and fill them out from a kind of skeleton staff to a fully manned divisional strength. And now more than ever, they needed junior leaders, and they simply didn't have the supply because they'd skimped for decades on training up new officers, coming up with a regularized, modernized educational pipeline for young officers. And such system as they did had completely fallen into abeyance during the Cultural Revolution. So, this is how, on the eve of the invasion, young privates with about a year of service like Wang Zhijun are suddenly getting promoted way beyond their experience and having to learn on the job. So, after these last minute personnel changes that promoted underqualified leaders, not to say bad leaders, but simply inexperienced, in an army that hadn't fought a big campaign since that walkover against India in 1962, see our earlier episodes, which was like letting a prison gang into a children's taekwondo class to spar the kids. Well, after all of this decay, it's not surprising that the beginning of the campaign in Vietnam was a complete farrago. First, the PLA went in woefully underarmed. Take Wang Zhijun as an example. As a squad leader in a machine gun company, so not a rifle company, but a machine gun support company attached to an infantry outfit. As the squad leader, Wang had an AK, and the rest of his squad had bupkis. They had their machine gun and a bunch of ammo for it, but no other small arms. So 13 guys in this bulked out machine gun squad, one AK. That's it. Also, these inexperienced small unit leaders didn't know enough about operating as a large company battalion and interoperating with tanks and things. So all kinds of fiascos happened. For example, Wang recorded in his memoir that a neighboring squad was dug in into foxholes on this steep downhill slope once they got into the field in Vietnam. And they were downhill from a road that was carrying a lot of men and equipment, and I presume maybe trucks even. And there was a light rain going that softened up the earth that they were dug into. And so three of the men's foxholes just collapsed under the downhill pressure of the traffic above them. And four guys died by getting buried alive in their own supposedly protective foxholes. In another example of leadership trouble, one night early in the invasion of Vietnam, Wang got summoned to someone else's company commander who said that there was a third company having trouble with Vietnamese infiltrators, and they were getting whomped and had asked him for reinforcements. Well, he explained he couldn't spare anybody, and so he said he wanted Wang's squad, who weren't even under his command, to go and provide reinforcements. Wang tactfully pointed out that he couldn't just abandon his position that he'd been ordered to defend and then go assign himself some new mission without proper orders. Second, Wang pointed out, blundering around a strange battlefield in the middle of the night without a guide to link up with strangers who don't know you're coming is a great way to get friendly fire casualties. Thankfully, that company commander relented in the face of Wang's good sense. However, the following day, Wang did actually see 10 plus bodies laid out at a roadside from some unit that had been persuaded to try this stupid mission and reinforce that company that was in trouble during the night. Turned out they ended up spending that whole night in a battle with the very unit that they were meant to reinforce. And now they were lying dead on a roadside. Even the clothing that Wang's men were issued was dumb. They were there in soft caps, not steel pots. And so Wang wrote that any head wound was virtually synonymous with certain death. And his soldiers, he said, were very afraid of getting wounded. If there had ever been a time when PLA soldiers really behaved like they did in propaganda stories, where they were braving hails of bullets, heedless of death, that time was not now. In reality, Wang found men were really afraid of fire. Of course, there was a thing for them, like what American soldiers used to call the $1 million wound, a wound that was just bad enough to get you evacuated back to China, but not serious enough to cripple or maim you. Wang recalls that the first casualty that his company took was a man who was shot through the chest, and he was carried away still conscious and actually screaming, "It's over for me. I'm gonna die. I don't want to die." But then he remarked the second casualty they took was this guy who got his arm broken by a shell burst. He was carried away on a stretcher, smiling and waving to his buddies with his good arm, yelling, "Hey guys, I'm not gonna die. You might, so take care, but good luck." As casualties mounted fast in that invasion, that opened up what you could call opportunities for advancement in the PLA, which is to say, junior leaders were getting killed, and young and experienced men were now having to be promoted up even faster to replace them. On the 10th day of the war, Wang was promoted to platoon leader to replace the old platoon leader, Lieutenant Pan, the one who could only half speak Mandarin, because he had been killed that afternoon by a freak artillery burst that took off his head. So Wang was called up, given the dead man's job and his pistol and holster. Hooray. Now, here's the surprising part. Honestly, when it came to casualties, Wang's company was actually doing pretty well, relatively speaking. There was another company in the 375th Regiment where they'd lost 7 company officers by about this point in the war. They were now promoting conscripts with a few months' service to officer positions if they would accept them. Because people were now getting the word that if you're a squad leader or a platoon leader, your days are numbered. So that's how you would get somebody who was barely a recruit now running a company of 100 plus men. I mean, imagine in the US Army, say, you're a private, not even a PFC, and then some major comes to you and says, "Hey, you're not a total fuck up. Want to be a company XO?" Ah, about the only person who couldn't have that job turned out to be Wang's former company XO, who was this standout soldier that Wang says he used to idolize when he was a new recruit. It turned out this excellent officer happened to have family ties to associates of Lin Biao, see our earlier episode, that tainted him politically. This incident happened when this man would have been in junior high. But for that, they relegated him to this rear echelon job over his splenetic objections, just in case this excellent officer might happen to be like at some genetic level a pro-Soviet revisionist mutant or something. Dumb, dumb, dumb. So in this case, the only guy who couldn't be Company XO was the Company XO who had a relative who knew somebody who knew a guy who had been too friendly to the Soviets. Wah, wah. We thought this kind of thing ended with the Cultural Revolution, but it lingered on into the 70s and even the 80s. Well, now that Wang was promoted to platoon leader, he got a casualty report that painted an ugly picture. For example, he learned that one of his old squad mates from his original squad had been found where he fell in a previous engagement. He had been hit in the back by several bullets while his squad was withdrawing under attack, and they couldn't take his body with them. Uh, Now he was informed that this other company had since retaken their old position and recovered their buddy's body. But after 4 days in the hot Vietnamese sun, this man's remains weren't in shape to move anymore, and he had to be cremated in place. At this phase in the war, the PLA was slugging its way slowly into the Vietnamese border country, kilometer by kilometer. one hill at a time. Wang was part of a machine gun company, remember, so they would be assigned to support that day's infantry attack on a given hill by emplacing themselves on some usefully located hillock nearby. And even though they themselves weren't charging up slopes onto objectives, they were, of course, prime targets for the Vietnamese machine guns and artillery. And so their protection in the machine gun units, it came really just from digging in well. That wasn't easy because often they'd be guided to their new position in the middle of the night in full darkness. And then they would have to dig in kind of blindly before they could even see the lay of the land when the sun came up. Also, even though they were supposedly protected by friendly lines, that didn't always work. First, sometimes their regiment would have to withdraw from the enemy, and there were occasions when somebody in the machine gun company didn't get the word in time and they left a subunit behind by accident. Communications were very bad during this campaign, and they were mostly happening by runner or field telephone, which was spotty. Moreover, even when the machine gun units were protected by friendly lines, the VPA, the Vietnamese People's Army, still proved really good at sneaking through those very lines. So it was that one day, Wang, our machine gun platoon leader, took one of his squads and rushed them up onto a small hillock to support an infantry attack up onto a nearby hill. And so they provided fire support up to the point where the PLA infantry became intermingled with the Vietnamese defenders on their objective. Then our machine gunners got to stop firing and see to the defense of their own position, which was on pretty decent terrain. On the plus side, they held this dome-shaped rocky formation that was elevated pretty well above the surrounding flat land. So that gave them clear observation. However, on the minus side, what they had was this bald, sheer dome of rock, and there was nothing to hide behind or dig into. Also, remember, they barely had guns. Their one squad, remember, had a single AK and its machine gun. That was it. So the best that they could do was to post one man, presumably with the AK, out there somewhere in a sentry post, and then hide everybody else in the squad in this cave that they found under their rocky dome. It was this long, narrow opening that they just happened to find there. And so they stuffed the men in there in this long, snaky line. And then they had, I guess, the platoon leader's pistol that he inherited from the dead man. And that was the best they could do. But at least it was better than standing out in the open, like doing the village people's YMCA dance, waiting to get shot by the VPA. They hid there safely through the night, but then at sunup, turned out the ground was still cloaked in that infamous northern Vietnamese fog. So there went their advantage of having a clear field of observation. So they stayed in their cave and they just trusted to the vigilance of their lone sentry out there cloaked in deep fog. Well, that trust was unfounded because quicker than you can say people's martyr, that sentry was dispatched to glory by a VPA recon squad who now started crawling over the dome, looking for the Chinese soldiers and probably looking for the mouth of the cave that they knew had to be there somewhere. Very, very bad because the Chinese defenders were down to one pistol and squeezed into that space that was so confined that one or two Vietnamese grenades pitched in there would have turned all these guys into ketchup. However, they did have grenades of their own. And at least for a few minutes longer, the Vietnamese ninjas up top still didn't know where they were and how to get to them. So the whole Chinese squad quietly passed their grenades one by one to the front of the line. Pins were pulled, and the man at the front of the line in the mouth of their cave started hucking the grenades as fast as he could up onto the rock, just blindly hoping for the best. And I can't believe that with all the fear and the butterfingers that brings, that he didn't fumble at least one of these grenades and blow them all up. But instead, they survived, and the Vietnamese attackers cleared out. So when the Chinese defenders emerged and looked around, they found Three dead Vietnamese scouts, and they saw two more wounded being evacuated by their squad's survivors. Hooray, they live another day. And in fact, a few hours later, they got more revenge. In the distance, the Chinese soldiers spotted this platoon sized group of Vietnamese who had gotten kicked off their hill by one of those big Chinese attacks. And now these Vietnamese remnants were trying to sneak away unmolested. Now, from where our protagonist stood, these Vietnamese survivors were still a couple kilometers away, outside the range of Wang's machine guns. But he ran to the rear to a field telephone and he put the word out to their parent units, heavy weapons. He said that he got back to his foxhole just in time to find the retreating Vietnamese in his binoculars and then watch them machine gunned, RPG'd, and even hit with artillery in direct fire mode. Apparently, a lot of people in Wong's battalion felt like it was payback time and that this Vietnamese platoon out there was their scapegoat. And Wang later wrote that all his guys were clapping and cheering as they saw this and found it very cathartic. Later, he wrote they found 20 some Vietnamese bodies out there. And Wang actually remarked that this was the only time that anything like that happened. Normally, he said the Vietnamese were very, very fastidious about these things. They would always sweep up the battlefield cleanly, as he put it. And they would seldom leave so much as a body behind, much less a wounded man. And he said that during that campaign, his entire battalion only took one prisoner, a wounded Vietnamese second lieutenant who had gotten left behind by his unit and then surrendered himself. Now, it did emerge that there were also other reasons that they hadn't taken more prisoners. During that same battle for what was called Hill 815, Wang got to witness something that before now had been quite rare in the PLA. It was this awesome Soviet style large scale artillery bombardment fired by mass artillery in the divisional rear into an elevated area where the Vietnamese had some artillery dug in very, very deep. This was a methodical artillery carpet bombing that Wang said made the target area look like it was getting beaten by yellow and black tidal waves and then left it looking like a geyser spouting black smoke. And following that attack, one of the Vietnamese defenders threw down his weapons and surrendered himself to the assault infantry as they combed the objective. But Wang wrote that the Chinese infantry brained this guy anyway, using their hand grenades. The CO from their unit tried to come out and discipline them, but his infantry just went nuts and they protested that all their dead and wounded were still laid out in the front lines instead of being evacuated long ago because, they said, this dead Vietnamese prisoner and his Vietnamese artillery buddies had been keeping them pinned down all day. So they were so enraged and so numerous that the Chinese CO just couldn't bring them to heel. If he persisted, he realized, in trying to bring them under control, he was really just going to make plain that he had already momentarily lost all his authority and that he basically had a mutiny in progress. And so this CO just dropped the matter. But Wang remarks that those kind of incidents were commonplace during this war and that they contributed a lot to the low prisoner count. Finally, now, about 2 weeks into the invasion, Wang's unit got to clean their weapons for the first time during a lull in the fighting. Remember that the Type 56 family was notoriously rust prone compared to more modern small arms, and even their ammo was getting rust spots. Wang's platoon had picked up AKs wherever they could, and now each squad had 5 or 6 AKs instead of its allotted one. This fits with a pattern that we've heard in all of our stories about the Sino-Vietnamese War, where individual soldiers very quickly abandoned existing PLA small arms doctrine. They learned that full auto was the way to go, and they would just pick up any automatic weapon they could and give away or maybe even discard their semi-automatic rifles where they needed to. Well, Wang, their platoon leader, had now availed himself of a captured Vietnamese folding stock AK, and he'd also picked up a Vietnamese pistol. He doesn't say what kind, but I have a lot of respect for him because in his memoir, he writes that he wasn't familiar with the pistol. And so as he and the men were cleaning their weapons, he starts cleaning this strange, unfamiliar trophy gun, and he negligently discharged it. And he came this close to hitting a cluster of his own men. The only thing that saved them was that a tree trunk happened to get in the way. I got a lot of respect for Wang for telling stories on himself like this. Less lucky, however, were some Vietnamese livestock. There was a bunch of jackass Chinese soldiers who thought it would be funny to go shoot some innocent farmer's cows. In fact, one of the culprits happened to be one of the unit's drovers, a specialist in the use of transport mules. Because remember, friends, even in the 1980s, the PLA still had a major place for pack animals and beasts of burden. And it takes a specialist to know the ways of mules and how to speak their language and care for them and get them to work for you. So this PLA mule driver and his buddies now decide that normally they don't get to play with guns, and they start plugging Vietnamese livestock in the distance with their owners watching this. Thank God, it just so happened that as this travesty was unfolding, a PLA lieutenant general was driving past. This was a general named Zhang Xideng, and he became kind of a hero in the Sino-Vietnamese War, partly because he was there ironing out their atrocious supply situation. This is a story for another day. But as General Zhang was doing this, he drove past and he saw the most un-Maoist, un-People's War, anti-hearts and minds thing ever, which is a bunch of invading PLA soldiers led by a livestock handler of all people, wantonly shooting the peasantry's livestock. So he stopped the car, raised holy hell, screamed some very un-Maoist things like, any man who doesn't stop right now, arrest him and bring him over, because I'm going to shoot him in the fucking head. Now, no soldiers were actually shot, but there was very serious discipline. And Wang writes that this affected the remainder of these men's careers. And the stupidity did not stop there. There in the rear, the whole machine gun company regathered itself. Remember, the machine gun squads and platoons were there to support various infantry subunits. And so they had been sent off with this or that regiment for its attack on Hill X or Hill Y. Now they were being regathered and topped up with replacement troops. They had taken so many casualties now. Wang's original squad had taken 100% casualties, killed and wounded. So, with all these casualties now, billets were being filled again by newly arrived replacement soldiers. So that meant that their company actually consisted largely of strangers and just even new recruits. And they were being led by people like Wang Zhijun, who just 6 weeks before had been a private and then promoted to squad leader for 10 days and then frocked as a platoon leader. And yes, even though Wang was a combat veteran now, he still was a junior enlisted man doing a lieutenant's job. And that kind of thing was happening in every blessed billet in the theater, from at least battalion level on down. So between the leader's youth and inexperience, the men's greenness, and everybody's unfamiliarity with each other, that was a recipe for dumb things. One of these dumb things was that as the men cleaned the machine guns for the first time in weeks, they also needed to clean the belts. And to do that, they needed to remove all the cartridges from the belts, one by one. Very tedious and boring work, right? Well, suddenly, one of the brand new privates received a visitation from the Good Idea Fairy. He realized it would be much faster to put the belts into the machine guns and then work the action and use the machine gun's own mechanism to pull the cartridges out of the belts. Now, sure, that would chamber live rounds in the presence of Vietnamese peasants who had thronged to watch what was happening. But Raw recruits wouldn't be dumb enough to negligently discharge the unfamiliar heavy weapons in the presence of civilians, right? Friends, I don't think I need to tell you the answer to that question. I'm only happy to say that nobody was hit by the bullets that they negligently fired. And because this was technically still a war zone, the MPs didn't come by and chop anybody's balls off. It was shortly after this that the war wound down. The PLA declared victory and it returned to China, and Wang's unit had the good fortune not to be bushwhacked on the way home. But there were whole units that remained missing and unaccounted for on the Vietnamese side of the fence. Some had been annihilated during the fighting, of course. Others had been captured, and some maybe didn't even know yet that the army was being withdrawn. We've said communications were quite bad. However, there were still other Chinese soldiers out there who were wandering lost. And we know that the Vietnamese were hunting these retreating Chinese remnants. We had the story of that cook who crawled through the jungle alone for days and days as an oozing human pustule before he got home. See our previous episode. For those MIAs and lost survivors, the Chinese guns fired illumination rounds over the border night after night after night as a sort of lighthouse beacon to the stragglers, saying, this way, follow the light home. Not much farther, get to these lights and you'll be safe. After Wang's unit got home, it took a lot of work for them to tabulate their casualties. They knew that they had come home with 47 wounded, and eventually some of those returned to the company after they recovered from their wounds, but most just got invalided straight out of the army from the hospital and then sent directly home, and they were never heard from again. Most troublesome for the officers now was just figuring out who among the missing and the dead were really missing and dead. It was far from unheard of for a soldier who was listed as dead to turn up alive. We saw this in an earlier episode about the PLA's greatest tank killer. He was decorated posthumously, but he didn't have a grave listed until some high-ranking PLA political officer just took hold of this mystery like a terrier who had trapped a rat. And after a year of looking, he found that China's greatest barehanded tank assassin, who was missing and presumed dead, was actually alive and working as a waiter in a shitty small town hotel. Well, in Wang's case, a guy from his company who had died earlier in the campaign from his extensive wounds, whose body they had been forced to leave behind, later it turned out came back to life and started crawling off the hill toward friendly lines. Thankfully, he got picked up by a Chinese recon squad and brought home. But that was very traumatic for Wang and his unit to learn that they had inadvertently left a buddy behind, alive and severely wounded, with nothing but his own lacerated hands and knees to try to extricate himself from danger. Sometimes, though, these mistakes just turned out to have a happy ending. When Wang's company sent one of their assistant squad leaders, this guy named Sun Ruilin, to one of the war cemeteries to lay a wreath, the caretaker heard what unit Sun was from and he bitched him out. And he said, "We have one from your company, and not one of you bums has ever come to tend to his graves. Come with me." So he led Sun over to this lonely, unkempt grave, and he pointed to the headstone and said, "There he is. Sun Ruilin, did you know him?" And Sun, who was standing right there, went, "But I know him. I am him." It turned out that during the fighting, Sun had left behind a belt that had a serial number or his name on it. And this belt had been picked up and worn by some other Chinese soldier who then fell in battle. And when he was interred at the cemetery, that was the only piece of identifying information they could find. And so they ended up putting Sun's own name on this headstone. And there he was confronting the site of his own grave. Also very tricky for the leaders now was decorations for the survivors and the wounded. some of the lads were definitely going to get high decorations. Like one guy in a sister company named Chen Quangang had become very, very famous. He was a messenger who had been sent to one of these cut-off units that didn't know that it was supposed to withdraw. So Chen volunteered to go and find these stragglers. He couldn't find them, and he ended up getting cut off behind the Vietnamese lines. And he was actually given up for dead. But instead, he went on a 3-day, one-man killing spree where he had no food, no water, and no contact with Chinese friendlies. But he did have an SKS and a knowledge of how to lick dew off of leaves and survive that way. And apparently, he had a very intense will to commit savagery upon the enemy. Because when he finally rejoined his unit days later, he and his SKS had racked up 11 kills alone. And by the way, if you're thinking, oh yeah, I remember that guy from a past episode. No, actually, that was another man, another one man, one SKS blank death warrant for any Vietnamese soldier who got in his way, named Yen Long. And that guy killed 56 people in one afternoon. Well, even though Chen Quangang only got 11 of the enemy, he was already a media sensation. And he certainly would have gotten the first class Order of Merit if he had survived the war. Chen died just a few days after his exploits, just like Yenlong did. However, Chen was survived by a lot of guys in his company who were legit heroes and absolutely deserved to be decorated. However, to the disappointment of the officers, the word came down from on high that in order to prevent basically grade inflation, they were going to cap the number of decorations at 20 medals per 100 men. And the number of first class awards couldn't exceed, it was either 3% or 5%. Well, commanders hated this. First, because of its artificiality. It just smacks of all the worst aspects of socialism with its arbitrary, meaningless quotas. And second, because these awards were actually going to have real world import for war veterans when they demobilized and they entered the civilian job market. There were lots of towns that these guys would be returning to that were holding jobs open specifically for any returning soldier who had been decorated. So the chains of command hated being put in this invidious position where basically they had to pick winners and losers from among their own men. And they were expecting this to be a morale killer. Happily, though, Wang wrote that their fears were not realized. Turned out their soldiers took the attitude that they were happy and lucky just to be home alive, and that the recognition should go to the guys who had been killed and wounded. Those of the veterans who were still able-bodied figured they really had nothing to complain about. They still had their whole lives ahead of them. They could get home, find wives and jobs, and live good, productive lives. Whereas it was the badly wounded men who might not have anything to fall back on. And then there were people like that man who had been severely wounded and left for dead, only to kind of resurrect himself and crawl back to civilization. He was severely maimed and crippled. So what that meant was that within Wang's company, there came to be a kind of conspiracy among everybody, that if you got nominated for a decoration, you would talk quietly to your bosses and try to get the award given to somebody else who really needed it. So on the battlefield, these guys may not have personified all the lionizing propaganda stories about yesterday's PLA who would fight without regard to injury or death. And sure, these soldiers in the late 70s, maybe they were slightly more an army of individuals and less an army of zealotic ideology. That probably isn't an altogether bad thing. But man, by their conduct when they got home, they showed that they certainly still had some of that old-time ethos of looking after the men in their group and just being glad that they had made it home. Friends, this has been Type 56, the story of China's army. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. You might even visit our Patreon page. But this course remains free for all the world's workers, soldiers, peasants, and over-promoted junior enlisted. I can't wait to talk to you next time.